So we start with block number 1 about statistical tools, and first of all, in the first learning sequence in this one, we're going to talk about the main definitions, terms, all the things that will help us to talk on the same language during this course. Okay. And we start with something that I already mentioned probably several times in the introductory video. It's the factors and responses. So what is a factor and what is a response? First of all, let's think about a typical experimental run. How do you run your experiment? How do you run one particular test? Usually you start with setting up experimental conditions, then you run it, and then you measure the response if you can do that, right? Now let's look at these 3 steps using the popcorn example. So in the popcorn example, you remember your system is a microwave oven. And then you can think about what kind of experimental conditions we have. Well, apparently, experimental conditions, it's something that you define mostly, and it's your inputs. It's inputs of the system. For example, you remember that you can optimize such things like time and power and amount of salt and so on and so forth. So these are also experimental conditions, right? And this is something that you will vary in order to optimize them. However, you can also have some fixed conditions. For example, popcorn brand. If you don't have a variety of popcorn brand in your house right now, then you will probably stick to one brand only. So it will influence the result, of course. It's also experimental condition. However, it's fixed, so you cannot change it. You will not vary it. The other fixed conditions can be, for example, the brand of your microwave phone, your skills as operator of the microwave phone, and so on. So these are experimental conditions that are fixed. And then finally, when you run the experiment, you can measure the outcome of your experiment. For example, we are talking about taste of the popcorn and color. Let's use different categories for the color, like beige color or white color or brown color and so on. Okay. Now look, the conditions, something that can change potentially the result of your experiment, we will call these things as a factor. It's based on the Latin word, which is the direct meaning is who, which acts, and it's pretty close definition to what conditions are. So conditions, it's the way to act. It's the way to change the potential outcome of experiment, and that's why we call them factors, right? And now look, factors can be something that you define, and it's controllable factors. But factors, it can be something that you cannot have a control. You do not have control of. And it's mostly it's external factors, for example, humidity in the room of your experiment and some other things that you cannot actually change, or maybe changing them will be quite tricky. Okay, so controllable, uncontrollable factors, it's something that change the experimental conditions. Now, the result of your experiment, the measurable result of experiment, it's the response. That's what we call as output before, right? So why we call it response? Because it kind of responds on the changes of your factors. And of course, the response can be just random. It can vary randomly because we have a lot of external factors, we have a lot of noise. But potentially, we believe that response depends on factors, at least on some of the factors, right? And we know one very important thing about response. We cannot set it directly. So you cannot, for example, set directly taste to 5. You cannot run an experiment and say, okay, I run experiment to get popcorn of taste 5. It's impossible. But what you can do, you can change factors and believe or hope that the final taste will be equal to 5, right? So we can change the response only indirectly. So it means that we can only measure the response. Now let me give you another example. Let's say we talk about a chemical reaction in this case. So you can see that I have several factors here shown in blue, and I have also 2 responses shown in orange. And you can see that factors actually have different shades of blue, right? So like blue and pale blue, so to speak. Why? Because these factors, temperature, title, pH, and concentration, it's something that I can vary easily during these experimental runs. However, the experimental skills and reactor properties, although I can change them as well, I can use different reactors or I can use different experimenters, operators. However, in this particular experiment, I'm not going to change them. So these are fixed factors. So they will not be changed. Both product yields and product purity, it's something that I measure, and apparently they will change in every next run. Will end up with a different product yield and different product purity. Now we can define a couple of additional terms. First of all, if you have factors and responses which vary, we call them also variables or variables if you want. Okay. And Factors, we will call factors as independent variables because we vary them independent of each other. So this is something that you can manage, right? You can change one particular factor independently of the other factors, okay? The response, we will call response as dependent variables because they potentially depends on the changes of the factors. You cannot change the response directly. So independent variables, it's the factors that vary. Dependent variables, it's response that vary. So that's how we define factors and responses in this course. And in the next video, we will talk a little bit more about the variables.